Daniel Hart, 34, walked into the Franklin County courtroom with a chillingly smug smile, calmly staring down the families of the victims he had killed in rituals he claimed were soul purifications. Confident that his blind faith would shield him from justice, he treated the trial like a final ceremony for the chosen one. But the testimony that left the courtroom in stunned silence came not from a forensic expert or an FBI investigator, but from the sole survivor of his hands, Ava Collins, the only witness. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest cases. On the evening of May 4, 2010, darkness fell over the quiet suburban streets of Columbus, Ohio, carrying the heavy humidity of early summer and the scent of wet earth after a recent rain. Fallen maple leaves littered the sidewalks, rustling under the cold glow of pale yellow streetlights. Each house along Maplewood was a small fortress of warmth and routine, where people locked themselves in familiar circles of safety to ward off the fragile feeling of the encroaching night. In a modest second-floor apartment at the end of the row, Grace Miller, 28, was settling in for a peaceful evening after a long day of teaching. The faint smell of a light meal lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of chamomile tea wafting from the kitchen. Grace was disciplined and introverted, a dedicated elementary school teacher, beloved by students and colleagues for her gentleness and devotion. Her life was a predictable cycle of work, reading, teaching, and tending to a few small potted plants on her windowsill, a simple tranquility familiar to everyone in the neighborhood. But that peace was an illusion, a fragile veneer, hiding something approaching, silent and unseen. Grace had lived in the apartment for over 3 years, part of a tight-knit community where people still greeted each other every morning, believing they knew their neighbors well. That night, the city was quieter than usual. A gentle breeze wove through the trees, the distant hum of traffic fading into the damp, chilly air, forming the familiar background music of a serene residential area. No one in the building knew that on that night, a pure malicious intrusion was drawing near. No motive, no reason, just senseless violence, waiting for an opportunity to shatter their false sense of security. The attack was not a robbery, nor a spontaneous act. It was the ruthless intervention of a cold, deliberate stranger's hand, sowing terror that police would later struggle to tie to any rational motive. The first official record of the tragedy was logged at 10:58 p.m., a brief, anonymous 911 call, reporting screams from apartment 203 on Maplewood Street. The dispatcher only caught a few chaotic sounds, a woman's voice choking mid-sentence, before the line went dead. 2 patrol cars were dispatched to the scene minutes later. When police arrived, the apartment building was still lit, doors locked, and the small street steeped in absolute silence. No bystanders, no signs of a struggle or burglary, just an unnatural stillness that sent chills down the officers' spines. They entered the building, the second-floor hallway dark and narrow, their footsteps echoing. A faint glow from apartment 203 spilled through the door crack, casting a dim streak on the worn gray carpet. They knocked, identified themselves as police, and demanded a response. No answer. After trying the handle and confirming the door was locked from the inside, they forced entry. The door swung open, revealing a space that seemed still alive. A neatly set dining table, clean dishes, a teacup on the table with dried watermarks around its rim. The faint smell of cooled chamomile tea, mixed with a metallic tang, a scent instantly recognizable to those who've entered a death scene. Grace Miller was found in the bedroom, on a neatly made bed, as if it had just been tidied. She lay on her side facing the window, eyes slightly open, her face so serene, it briefly sparked hope she was merely sleeping. But the air in the room was thick, icy, and heavy with a suffocating stench. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. The apartment was eerily quiet. Everything remained as it was before death, a contrived order often left by methodical killers. Police sealed the scene immediately. Every detail was photographed, noted, and sampled. The living room showed no signs of forced entry, windows latched from the inside, the door lock intact. This led investigators to their first conclusion. Grace had opened the door for her killer, likely someone she knew. Under the forensic team's cold lights, small details emerged. On the front door handle, a distinct fingerprint, clear, deep, possibly left by someone with wet or sweaty hands. On the table, beside Grace's teacup, was a faint circular mark from another cup, not listed among her belongings. During the bedroom examination, forensic technicians found a dark brown male hair on the bedsheet and a small ash mark near the bed's base. Grace didn't smoke. Evidence began pointing to a man's presence, someone who had been there for a long time, calmly. But what silenced the entire team was a small folded piece of paper neatly placed under the mirror on the dresser. The handwriting was slanted, scrawled, but forceful. "She has been set free. No signature, no trace." Everyone in the room knew this was no joke. The word "set free" carried a religious or ritualistic tone. Police photographed it, bagged it as evidence, and that night, lead investigator Paul Henderson said only one thing: "We're dealing with someone who believes he has a reason." The initial forensic report showed the victim died from mechanical asphyxiation. No clear ligature marks from a rope, just a faint bruise around the neck, as if pressed by something soft, possibly a pillow or hands. No internal injuries, no drugs, no signs of assault. The death was quick, quiet, and controlled. Grace died in a perfectly staged silence. News spread within hours. As police carried the body out on a stretcher, covered with a white sheet, reporters were already at the building. 28-year-old teacher found dead in locked apartment, read the headline on WHIO TV5 the next morning. Shaking Columbus residents. Images of Grace, smiling at her graduation ceremony, were plastered everywhere, starkly contrasting her mysterious death. Maplewood Heights residents held a makeshift vigil, placing flowers at the steps and lighting candles by apartment 203's window, where the lights remained on. Grace's family from Dayton was brought in that afternoon. Her mother, Eleanor Miller, collapsed upon seeing the sealed apartment where her daughter had lived her early career years. Her father, Richard Miller, sat in silence, answering police with a choked voice. She never hated anyone. She only knew teaching, reading, and tending to her plants. At Roosevelt Elementary, where Grace worked, students and colleagues gathered in the library, crying upon hearing the news. Principal Claire Hendricks said in a brief press conference, "Grace was someone everyone trusted. We can't understand why this happened." That evening, the investigation team received results from the digital forensics lab. Grace's computer had no threatening emails, no unusual messages. She had no boyfriend, no online dating profiles. Her phone call history stopped at 9:47 p.m., about an hour before the attack. The last call was to a colleague, discussing a student's test. Everything was infuriatingly normal. Inspector Henderson reviewed security footage from the neighborhood. A male figure appeared in a frame at 9:58 p.m., wearing a baseball cap and a black jacket, lingering outside Grace's building for over 2 minutes. He looked up toward the second-floor apartment, then moved into an area without cameras. No one saw him leave. As those blurry images aired on the evening news, fear gripped Columbus. Maplewood residents changed locks, installed cameras, and avoided going out after 9 p.m. On social media, people discussed the locked apartment murder, while news channels dubbed the killer the Liberator, taken from the note left in the room. Police couldn't yet identify the man in the video, but Henderson knew this wasn't an ordinary criminal. The preliminary report sent to the department was 4 lines long: no signs of robbery, no emotional motive. Scene meticulously staged. Suspect likely has delusional religious or ritualistic tendencies. Columbus, a city proud of its Midwestern calm, was now steeped in unease. Each candle outside Grace Miller's apartment was not just a tribute, but a silent prayer. And as the community struggled to reclaim a sense of safety, a small, seemingly insignificant detail, the strange fingerprint on the door handle, sat in the Columbus Police Department's lab, waiting to be matched. It would spark a chain of events leading to the coldest confrontation in Ohio's courtroom history. The Columbus Police Department's Special Operations Room was bathed in harsh white light. On the digital board, photos from Grace Miller's crime scene were pinned in sequence: the pristine bed, the note reading, "She has been set free," the small ash mark, the magnified fingerprint. Inspector Paul Henderson stood with arms crossed, staring silently for a long time. "This isn't about money or love," he said. "This is a ritual." The team reviewed all criminal records from the past 12 months in Central Ohio. On a map, 4 missing persons cases were marked: Allison Price, 30, Newark; Laura Kent, 26, Marion, and 2 others in Zanesville and Lancaster. All 4 were single women, aged 25, 35, vanished without a trace. No robbery, no assault. When cross-referencing old biological samples, the tech team paused. The dark brown hair from Grace Miller's apartment matched a hair from Allison Price's disappearance 4 months earlier. The first time he kidnapped, the next he killed. The fingerprint match arrived at Henderson's desk at 3 a.m. The strange print matched Daniel Hart, 34, a former Marine corporal, honorably discharged in 2007 for violent behavior. His military file was thick: discipline issues, conflicts, self-isolation. One incident was highlighted in red. In 2006, Hart carved religious quotes about soul purification into a barracks wall. After leaving the military, he drifted across Ohio, jobless, living off unemployment benefits. Once arrested in Mansfield for public disturbance, the team contacted the Veterans Hospital where Hart had been treated. His doctor confirmed a diagnosis of delusional disorder with savior complex, a condition where the patient believes they're chosen to cleanse others' sins. The treatment file ended with the doctor's scrawled note: "Patient uses religious language to justify controlling behavior, especially toward women he deems fallen." Henderson read it and whispered, "She has been set free." That's his voice. Over the next 3 days, the team worked relentlessly. Credit records, welfare files, and spending cards were scoured. The first lead, Hart's welfare card, was swiped at a Mansfield convenience store over 100 kilometers from Columbus on the evening of May 6, 2 days after Grace's death. Gas station security footage nearby captured a man, about 6'1", muscular, in a baseball cap and black jacket, matching the figure from the Maplewood video. He bought coffee and cigarettes, paid cash, and drove off in an old silver-gray pickup truck with no front plate. FBI agents assisted with mobile data analysis. They traced Hart's GPS and cell tower signals. From 9 to 11 p.m. on May 4th, his phone pinged in South Columbus, within a 2-kilometer radius of Maplewood Heights. Then it went offline, only reactivating the next morning in Mansfield. He knew how to avoid tracking, but didn't anticipate Columbus's upgraded civilian camera system. Henderson built a behavioral profile. Victims were single women, died in serene poses, no robbery, no assault. The note suggested the suspect sought purification. Handwriting analysis with Allison Price's case showed a 97% match. Henderson concluded, he doesn't kill out of hatred, he kills because he believes he's doing right. The media began calling him the Liberator. Police kept his real name under wraps, fearing he'd flee. A small team was sent to Mansfield, where Hart had rented a room at a roadside motel on Route 42. The motel owner, Karen Rhodes, said, "He was quiet, paid cash, but often left at 3 or 4 a.m. Once I saw him bring back heavy wooden boxes. When police searched, the room was empty. The tenant had left 2 days earlier, leaving a burnt smell and old newspapers. On the table was a paper about Grace Miller's case, with no signs of forced entry, underlined in red. The tech team found fingerprints on a soda can, matching Grace's case. On the bed was a leather-bound notebook. The first page read, "Salvation comes not from pleading, but from action." The following pages repeated 4 words: liberation, purification, order, sanctification. In a drawer was an Ohio map, marked in red at 4 points: Columbus, Newark, Lancaster, Mansfield, matching the missing persons' locations. No doubt remained. A statewide arrest warrant was issued at 11:18 a.m. on May 9, 2010. Hart's photo was sent to all Ohio law enforcement. Official description: male, 34, 6'1", brown hair, gray eyes, long scar on right wrist, considered extremely dangerous. Police believed he carried a military dagger and possibly an illegal handgun. That afternoon, a mechanic shop employee, 15 kilometers from Mansfield, reported a man resembling Hart buying motor oil and a spare gas can. When asked, he said he was living in an abandoned house at the edge of Franklin Forest. Police verified the location, finding a row of derelict houses once owned by Franklin Timber, vacant since 1995, isolated in sparse woods. Henderson studied satellite images of the area, showing a single dirt road leading in. "If he thinks he's working for God," he said softly, "that's his sanctuary." That evening, all data, fingerprints, psychiatric records, gas station video, behavioral map, was compiled into case file C0410 Grace Miller. At the top was the arrest warrant with Daniel Hart's face. Under notes, Henderson wrote one line: "He won't stop." Outside, night fell over Columbus. The lights in the command room remained on. In Mansfield, early summer winds swept through the trees, stirring road dust into small whirlwinds. Somewhere in the Franklin Forest, a man moved slowly, unhurried, unafraid, believing he was still on his chosen path. And at that moment, the entire Ohio police force began the largest manhunt in years. Dusk had just settled when a convoy of police vehicles quietly entered the Franklin Forest, where a row of wooden houses, abandoned for nearly 2 decades, stood. The air was thick with tension. The order to surround the area came from headquarters at 7:45 p.m. Black SUVs, parked about 100 meters from the houses, headlights off, with only the faint blue glow of communication screens reflecting on the officers' faces. Inspector Paul Henderson signaled to stop, his voice low. "No noise. We work in silence." The rustle of dry grass mingled with their rapid breaths as they moved deeper into the area. The wooden house emerged in a clearing, its roof half collapsed, walls covered in moss, but a thin wisp of smoke rose from a broken chimney. Someone was inside. The SWAT team split into 2 groups, encircling from both sides. Through a window crack, a faint flashlight beam flickered from the ground floor. No voices, only the sound of wind whistling through rotting planks. A soft moan from inside made the team freeze. It wasn't a man's voice, Henderson signaled. 2 officers breached the back door, rushing in. The stench of mold, mixed with a heavy metallic odor, hit them instantly. The main room was littered with debris, clothes, and women's items strewn about: handbags, shoes, earrings, Idaho cards. In a corner, a filthy mattress bore dried blood stains. The faint moan came again, clearer now. A small door at the end of the hallway was locked with an old iron padlock. When they broke it open, they saw a young woman tied to a bedpost with cloth strips. Her body emaciated, eyes closed. She was barely breathing. Henderson knelt, checked her pulse and shouted, "She's alive. Get an ambulance now." The woman was Ava Collins, 25, a Mansfield Community College student, missing for 8 days. She was carried out in a rescue blanket, trembling, unable to say anything except a whispered, "He said I needed to be saved." As the rescue team withdrew, another group searched the upstairs. They found Daniel Hart in the attic, sitting on the wooden floor beside an oil lamp and an open Bible. He didn't resist. When police shone their flashlights on him, he looked up, eyes empty, murmuring softly, "I knew you'd come." His hands, raised, were still dusted with wood shavings and ink. A handgun, with its magazine removed, lay a few steps away. Henderson signaled to cuff him. Daniel bowed his head, calmly letting them lead him out. No shouting, no struggle, as if he'd prepared for this moment. The scene was sealed immediately. Forensics spent nearly 8 hours collecting evidence. In the rotting house, they found 8 women's handbags, 4 cell phones, blood-stained cloth scraps, and a wooden box containing personal items. Rings, name tags, photos, all neatly arranged in rows. On a wooden table in the main room, was a thick leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked, filled with scribbled scriptures and cryptic phrases. One page in the middle, written in bold red ink, read, "6 souls have been purified. One remains unfinished." Below was a list of names: Allison, Laura, Rachel, Dana, Grace, and Ava. Next to Ava's name was a dash, not yet crossed out like the others. In the attic, forensics recovered hair, dried skin, and DNA matching 3 missing victims. All were sealed in evidence bags. Daniel was transported to Columbus that night under the escort of 3 vehicles. He sat in the middle seat, staring straight ahead, hands cuffed in front of him. As the car passed the city limits sign, he gave a faint smile. An officer beside him reported that he didn't sleep during the over 2-hour drive, only muttering disjointed phrases about light and redemption. The next morning, the first interrogation began at Columbus Police Headquarters. The interrogation room had cameras and one-way glass, with Henderson, FBI agent Ellen Ruiz, and FBI psychologist Claire Monroe observing from behind. Daniel sat upright, hands neatly on the table, face expressionless. He wore a gray prisoner's uniform, wrists marked by cuff scars. When the detective asked his name, he replied clearly, "Daniel Hart, 34, U.S. citizen." His voice was unnervingly calm. Initial questions focused on Grace Miller. He didn't deny meeting her but claimed it wasn't a crime. "I saved her," he said, eyes unwavering. "She begged for peace, and I gave it to her." When asked about the other women, he shrugged. They were all the same, lost, needing guidance. Investigators pressed with DNA evidence and items from the house. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "You worship material things, not me." Throughout the over 4-hour interrogation, he showed no anger or fear. When questioned about Ava Collins, the survivor, he replied in a voice soft as a whisper, "I wasn't done with her. You interfered with God's work." Each response silenced the observation room. Henderson leaned toward Claire Monroe, whispering, "He believes it. Not faking insanity, not stupid. He thinks he's chosen." As the interrogation ended, Daniel requested a cigarette. Denied, he stared into the one-way glass, as if knowing someone was there, and said slowly, "She was set free. You should thank me." The words echoed through the room's speakers, chilling everyone. The psychological analysis team began profiling his behavior. During the entire interrogation, Daniel never looked down, avoided light, or showed physiological stress, steady heart rate, even voice, pupils undilated. He maintained unusually long eye contact, often smiling faintly when asked about guilt. His repeated action was rotating his right wrist, where a long scar ran. When asked about it, he said, "A reminder that the body is just a tool." Experts concluded he had perfect emotional control, characteristic of a criminal with messiah complex, deluded into believing he was a savior of humanity. As Henderson left the room, Daniel remained in the same posture. The confiscated Bible from the scene sat before him. He glanced at it for a few seconds and smiled. "I don't need to read it anymore," he said softly. "I've written the next part." The words were recorded, filed under Case C0410 Grace Miller, first interrogation. That afternoon, forensic test results arrived. DNA on Ava Collins's restraints and dried skin on the attic chair matched Daniel Hart perfectly. Technicians finalized the report, delivering it to Henderson. Despite the clear evidence, he kept a cold expression. "We don't just have a killer," he said. "We have someone who thinks he's right." That night, the investigation room was locked, with only a dim light shining on the table where Daniel last sat before being transferred to the central jail. He bowed his head, hands clasped, muttering incoherent phrases. When an officer came to escort him, he looked up, smiled, and said in a low, even voice, "God sent you at the right time." No one replied. The steel door closed, leaving only the cold clang of metal, an omen of the investigative storm about to begin. At noon on May 12, 2010, the Ohio State Forensic Laboratory sent its final report to the Columbus Police Department. DNA samples from the Mansfield abandoned house matched data from 5 missing victims and 1 survivor. Results were conclusive: hair, blood, epithelial tissue, and fingerprints confirmed Daniel Hart as the sole person present at every scene. Analysis of time of death and samples showed the crimes followed a pattern. Victims were approached in private spaces, held for days, then strangled. The consistent body positioning, arms folded across the chest, head tilted right, indicated ritualistic behavior. No evidence of post-mortem sexual assault was found. As the results arrived, Henderson reviewed each page, underlining recurring details. He noted in the margin, "Not impulsive, not emotional. All staged." A psychological report by FBI agent Claire Monroe and her team was attached, describing Hart as a repeat offender with Messiah complex traits, believing he was a tool for purifying souls. The crimes were tied to religious language and salvation symbolism. The report concluded, his motive isn't personal, but tied to a concept of sin. He kills not out of hatred, but because he believes he's fulfilling a divine mission. Forensics continued analyzing evidence from Mansfield. Hart's DNA was found on victims' clothes, handbags, and personal items. Blood on the attic floor matched Laura Kent, missing since January. A video recovered from a damaged memory card in a digital camera showed Hart reciting scripture in a low voice. Then the camera panned down, revealing an immobile woman's hand. The footage was filed as direct evidence. On the afternoon of May 14th, the over 700-page investigation file was sent to the Ohio State Prosecutor's Office in Franklin County. Chief Prosecutor Jack Reynolds personally received it. In a brief press conference, he stated, "Scientific evidence, witness testimony, and criminal behavior all point to one person. We will prosecute Daniel Hart to the fullest extent." After the conference, the prosecution and investigation teams reviewed every detail, crime timelines, Ava Collins' testimony, forensic results, and the first interrogation. All aligned, forming a seamless chain of evidence with no gaps. On May 16th, the official indictment was completed. Daniel Hart was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of rape with violence against the surviving victim. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The indictment's opening stated, "The defendant acted deliberately and with premeditation, aiming to create a sense of purifications for himself and the victims. These are organized crimes with ritualistic and repetitive elements." The court appointed 3 public defenders, led by Robert Haynes, a veteran criminal law expert. On the morning of May 17th, Haynes met Hart at Chillicothe jail. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The record noted the defendant was calm, cooperative, and fully aware of his legal situation. When asked about the charges, Hart said, "I didn't kill anyone. I did what was assigned." Immediately after, Haynes requested a psychiatric evaluation to consider a reduced sentence. The prosecution opposed. An FBI psychiatric report confirmed Hart was fully competent and in control of his actions. It stated, "The defendant is lucid, capable of logical reasoning, and understands legal consequences. His extreme religious beliefs are a fixed ideology, not hallucinations." The psychiatric evaluation request was denied. On May 18th, Henderson's team finalized the comprehensive case report, highlighting 3 key traits. 1. Systematic repetition. Crimes occurred every 6 to 8 weeks in private spaces, with no theft. Delusional religious motive. Each scene had purification-related evidence, books, notes, or ritual symbols. 3. Absolute control. Minimal victim resistance indicated meticulous planning. These findings were sent to the Ohio State Prosecutor's Office as the basis for prosecution. That afternoon, Henderson signed the final page of the file, officially handing over the case. On May 20th, the Franklin County Supreme Court announced the preliminary hearing for June 6, 2010. Notices were sent to victims' families, witnesses, and FBI representatives. The press widely covered it, calling it Ohio's biggest criminal case in 2 decades. In jail, Daniel Hart was moved to a high-security solitary cell for dangerous inmates, monitored 24 hours, allowed only 30 minutes daily in the yard. Guards reported he remained calm, spoke little, occasionally wrote on the wall and erased it. When asked, He said, "I'm recording the truth." Outside, Ohio's justice system operated at full throttle. Physical evidence, DNA results, psychological reports, and witness testimonies were sealed in the case file for State of Ohio versus Daniel Hart. The case name was officially announced on May 22, 2010. Columbus entered a heavy period of anticipation. In the prosecutor's office, Jack Reynolds looked at the thick file before him and said quietly to his assistant, "We're not just trying a killer, we're trying someone who thinks he's God." On the morning of June 6, 2010, the Franklin County Supreme Court opened the preliminary hearing for State of Ohio versus Daniel Hart. Early on, the courthouse was packed with reporters, news vans, and curious onlookers. Security barriers surrounded the premises, with police patrolling constantly. The press dubbed it the trial of the decade, a case that shook Ohio, where a former Marine, who claimed to be God's tool, had killed multiple women. Inside the courtroom, a carefully selected jury of 12 locals sat in a tense mix of curiosity, dread, and silence. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Mary Sullivan entered, ordering everyone to rise. The trial officially began. Daniel Hart was led in, wearing a gray prison uniform, hands cuffed. He walked slowly, head held high, his gaze sweeping the courtroom as if observing a crowd of strangers. When his cuffs were removed, he sat in the defendant's chair, face calm, lips curling into a faint, ambiguous smile. In the front row, the victims' families bowed their heads, some breaking into tears upon seeing him. Prosecutor Jack Reynolds stood to deliver his opening statement. His voice was firm, deliberate, each sentence weighted. "Today you will hear the story of a man who believed he was given the right to decide who deserves to live and who must die. Daniel Hart did not kill for money or hatred. He killed because he believed he was God." He listed the key evidence: DNA matching at 5 crime scenes, consistent fingerprints, items recovered from Mansfield, a restored video from a camera, testimony from the surviving witness, Ava Collins, and the recorded interrogation where the defendant admitted to saving them from suffering. Each time a victim's name was mentioned, Reynolds paused, leaving a heavy silence. On the other side, the defense team, led by Robert Haynes, sat quietly, taking notes, showing no reaction. Daniel Hart stared straight at the prosecution, his expression barely changing. When the phrase organized and deliberate behavior was mentioned, he let out a soft chuckle, audible enough to make the courtroom turn toward him. The judge immediately called for order. Reynolds paused, locked eyes with the defendant, then continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, what's terrifying is not just his crimes, but the calmness with which he speaks of them." The prosecutor displayed the first crime scene photos. A large screen in the courtroom showed Grace Miller's apartment, the scrawled note reading, "She has been set free." Next came evidence from Mansfield. Restraints, the notebook, a map marked with the locations of the disappearances. The courtroom was silent. When the brief restored video from the memory card played, the judge halted it due to intense reactions from the victims' families. After the prosecution's presentation, the defense gave a brief statement. Haynes began by emphasizing that every citizen deserves a fair trial. He acknowledged the case's severity, but argued that my client is a deeply disturbed individual, living in a warped religious world he believes is real. He urged the court to view Hart as a patient, not a monster. His words prompted glances among the jurors, while Daniel merely smiled, seemingly pleased with the description. The trial moved into the afternoon, with detailed evidence presentation. Forensic experts were called to the witness stand. Dr. Linda Moore, chief medical examiner, confirmed that DNA traces matched Daniel Hart at all 5 crime scenes. She described the sample comparison methods, times of death, and the method of asphyxiation, all consistent. When the prosecution asked if there was any chance the defendant was uninvolved, she replied, "No. The probability of error is virtually 0. Next was testimony from Agent Claire Monroe. She summarized Hart's psychological profile: an individual with absolute control, repetitive behavior, believing he was on a divine mission. Monroe described him as showing no emotion when discussing death, using only religious language to describe violent acts. When the prosecution asked if she believed Hart was legally competent, she answered firmly, yes. He knew what he was doing and why. During Monroe's testimony, Hart leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes on the ceiling, fingers tapping the table, a gesture many noticed as an attempt to appear indifferent, as if the proceedings were a ritual staged for him. The press reported every minute. Major outlets like the Columbus Dispatch and USA Today provided live updates, accompanied by images of Hart's half-smile in the courtroom. CNN aired a special evening report, calling it a trial of faith and sin. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Hart as pure evil, others as a deranged man obsessed with religion. But his chilling calmness undeniably shocked the nation. The first day ended with the prosecution's summary. Reynolds concluded, the defendant didn't just kill, he orchestrated their deaths as a ritual. He shows no remorse, no fear, and that is why justice must be present here today. Hart maintained his smile, eyes on the judge, silent. Judge Sullivan declared a recess, with the trial to continue the next morning with witness examinations and additional evidence. As police escorted Hart out, flashes from dozens of cameras lit up. A reporter captured him turning to face the courtroom, his gaze indifferent, lips moving as if saying something inaudible. In the front row, Grace Miller's mother collapsed into her husband's shoulder, while outside, a crowd packed the area, silently watching the prisoner transport vehicle drive away. Columbus had never seen a trial like this, both a judicial process and a confrontation between justice and the chilling arrogance of a man who believed he transcended it all. The morning of the trial's second day, the Franklin County courtroom was packed. Media, from across the state, had set up cameras from the hallway to the courthouse steps. The atmosphere was different from the opening, more orderly, but heavier. Daniel Hart was brought in, wearing a white dress shirt, uncuffed. He walked slowly, head slightly raised, eyes fixed on the jury, as if studying each member. His faint half-smile appeared again, like a familiar gesture. Judge Mary Sullivan struck her gavel, opening the second day. The defense began with Robert Haynes, who had handled major criminal cases in Ohio, but never a client like Daniel Hart. Haynes stood, adjusted his microphone, and looked at the jury before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, today we do not deny that tragic events occurred, but what we must consider is whether the man sitting there truly understood the nature of his actions. Haynes argued that Daniel Hart suffered from severe religious delusional disorder, a condition making him believe he was on a divine mission. He insisted Hart acted not out of malice, but from a loss of control due to religious delusions. Haynes emphasized, no sane person could view murder as salvation. My client is not a monster, but a sick man. He requested the court reconsider Hart's mental state to assess criminal responsibility. Haynes presented a medical file over 200 pages from the Mansfield Veterans Hospital, documenting Hart's treatment from 2007-2008 after his military discharge. The file noted a diagnosis of religious delusional disorder, chronic depression, and prolonged insomnia. A doctor's note read, patient believes he is chosen to guide others to the light, exhibits obsession with concepts of sin and redemption. Haynes read the excerpt aloud, pausing to glance at Daniel, as if underscoring his client's pathology. But Daniel sat still, hands clasped, smiling faintly. Haynes continued. We do not deny the consequences of his actions, but we deny free will in those moments. Hart was driven by religious delusions and warped beliefs, unable to distinguish right from wrong. You cannot sentence to death someone without rational capacity. He requested a pause for a second psychiatric evaluation, arguing the FBI's prior conclusion failed to fully explore the depth of religious psychopathology. The prosecution stood almost immediately after Haynes finished. Jack Reynolds approached the stand, his voice calm but sharp. We're not talking about a man out of control. We're talking about a man who planned, who knew exactly what he was doing, and how. He replayed part of the Mansfield video, showing Daniel reciting scripture before lowering the camera to capture a victim's motionless hand. Reynolds pointed at the screen. This is not the act of a madman. This is a man staging. He chose the angle, the words, the moment. He controlled everything, including their deaths. The courtroom air grew thick. Reynolds stepped toward the jury, speaking slower. He's not insane, he believes, but with purpose. He speaks of God, but acts like he wants to be God. Such a man is not driven by illness, but by arrogance. The prosecutor argued that Hart maintained high control throughout the crime spree, selecting similar victims, cleaning crime scenes, leaving symbolic messages, and moving between cities without detection. He asserted, if he were out of control, he couldn't have operated with such precision for 3 years straight. The defense objected, arguing that calculation doesn't rule out mental illness. Haynes cited a similar Ohio court precedent, where a delusional defendant still committed organized crimes. He stressed, he didn't hide out of guilt, but because he believed his mission needed protection. Judge Sullivan halted the debate, granting the jury a 15-minute break. During that time, Daniel sat still, eyes fixed on the jurors. He studied each one, his gaze long and slow, as if assessing who believed him, who feared him. One juror, an older woman in the second row, looked down, avoiding his stare. When the trial resumed, Reynolds submitted additional evidence of the defendant's lucidity, interrogation transcripts, where Daniel described each crime in detail, from victim selection to travel times between cities. He emphasized, he remembers every minute. He said, I opened the door, I cleaned up, I knew they'd find me. He's proud of it. Haynes objected, arguing the statements reflected deep delusion, not lucidity. He read a transcript excerpt where Daniel said, I only followed orders, they were set free, and I was just the tool. Haynes looked around the courtroom, a man who believes he's a divine tool. That's not reason, that's illness. The debate lasted over 2 hours. Finally, Judge Sullivan ruled, the court has considered the arguments and determines there is insufficient basis to pause the case for additional psychiatric evaluation. Defendant Daniel Hart will continue to be tried under the framework of first-degree murder. The ruling was read clearly, each word resonating in the heavy atmosphere. Hart listened, tilted his head slightly, then turned to the jury. He smiled, a slow, almost defiant smile. The gesture made Reynolds grip his documents tighter, while Haynes silently flipped to a new page in his file. The press captured the moment, calling it the coldest smile in the courtroom. As the judge declared a recess for the afternoon, Daniel stood, adjusted his collar, and surveyed the courtroom as if he'd completed a performance. Before being let out, he paused, his gaze sweeping the jury once more. He said nothing, only offering a thin, confident smile, as if the trial's outcome was a minor part of a plan he already knew. On the third day, the Franklin County courtroom was packed. From early morning, media from across the state flooded Columbus, while outside, hundreds of residents held signs demanding justice for the victims. Police set up metal barriers, controlling every entrance. The air was thick with silence and tension. When Judge Mary Sullivan announced the start of witness examinations, all cameras turned to the stand. The first witness was Ava Collins, the sole survivor. She stepped up, frail and gaunt, faint marks still visible on her neck. Her eyes flickered with fear upon seeing Daniel Hart a few meters away. He tilted his head, lips curling slightly, a chilling smile that hushed the room. Ava clenched her fists, steadying herself, and began. That night, I'd just left school when a man stopped his car by the road. He said it broke down, asked for help. As I approached, something was pressed over my face. When I woke, I was in a dark room, hands tied, mouth taped. She paused, taking a deep breath. He said I was chosen to be set free. Every day he read the Bible, told me to pray. I don't know if I survived by luck, or because he wasn't ready to kill me. Her voice faded, hoarse. When asked about her rescue, Ava said, I remember lights shining in and someone shouting. I thought I was dead until they cut the ropes. She bowed her head, eyes wet. The courtroom was silent. Reynolds thanked her and ended his questioning. The defense asked no questions, only taking brief notes. Daniel Hart stared at Ava unblinking, expressionless, as if observing a detail in his own book. Next were Grace Miller's family. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor, took the stand under soft lighting. Eleanor, trembling, held her daughter's photo, her voice weak but clear. "My daughter was kind, dedicated. She only knew teaching and going home. The last day she called me, said someone knocked. I told her not to open it, but she laughed, said it was probably a neighbor. That was the last time I heard her voice." Her words brought tears to some in the room. Richard stood beside his wife, avoiding the defendant's gaze. "I thought we lived in a safe place. That ended when I saw my daughter's photo on that screen." His voice broke. Daniel sat still, eyes cold and forward, showing no remorse or reaction. The final expert witness was Dr. Claire Monroe, FBI criminal psychologist, who analyzed Hart's behavioral profile. She took the stand, voice calm. "Daniel Hart is not insane. He has God complex, a delusional belief that he holds power over life and death." She explained that this syndrome is common in those from military or extreme religious backgrounds, where power and faith intertwine. "Hart didn't kill to destroy," she said. "He killed to prove his power, that he could save souls by taking lives." Reynolds asked, "Does the defendant understand the consequences of his actions?" Monroe replied, "Absolutely. He knew exactly what he was doing. He's not irrational. He acted with absolute belief that he was right." Haynes objected, arguing Monroe's assessment was theoretical, not based on direct examination. The judge overruled, allowing the testimony to continue, affirming its expert value in clarifying motive. After Monroe's testimony, the prosecution displayed physical evidence. The large screen showed crime scene photos, the note, the notebook, and the restored Mansfield video. Each victim's name brought their image: Allison, Laura, Rachel, Dana, Grace. Last was Ava Collins, the survivor, sitting with her head bowed in the front row. When the video played Hart, saying, "She has been saved," the room shivered. He looked up at the screen, his faint smile clear under the lights. The prosecutor presented the leather notebook from the scene, filled with scrawled words: purification, liberation, order, light. Reynolds said, "This isn't random evidence. This is the diary of a man who believed he acted for God." Outside the courthouse, chaos brewed. Hundreds gathered along High Street, holding signs: "Justice for Grace," "Stop playing God," "No mercy for the murderer." A group of Catholics prayed collectively, while some fringe religious groups defended Hart, calling him a misunderstood servant of God's will. Media captured the scene live, contrasting angry and praying crowds outside the courthouse. Police reinforced security to maintain control. Major news outlets, CNN, ABC, The New York Times, ran headlines: "The Liberator Trial Shocks America." Nightline aired a special report, interviewing theologians and psychologists. One researcher said, "What's terrifying isn't just his actions, but his conviction. When someone believes they're God's hand, they have no limits." In the courtroom, as the prosecutor concluded, Judge Sullivan called for a recess. The jury stood and left in silence. Daniel Hart remained seated, eyes fixed on the blank screen, his expression like an artist admiring his own work. A reporter described, "In a room filled with evidence of his crimes, he sat there, calm as if he'd just fulfilled his mission." As police approached to escort him, Hart turned to look at Ava Collins. His gaze was empty, no hatred, no remorse, just smugness. Ava turned away, her hands clenched. Outside, a nearby church bell tolled, its somber sound blending with the crowd's shouts and the hum of a circling helicopter above Columbus. Closing the third day of the trial, a day when Ohio faced a warped faith and evil cloaked in salvation. On the fourth day, Judge Mary Sullivan opened the session with the defendant's direct examination. The courtroom was packed, public seats filled, dozens of TV cameras aimed at the witness stand. All awaited the moment Daniel Hart would face prosecutor Jack Reynolds head-on, the centerpiece of the case. Daniel entered in a gray prison uniform, hands uncuffed. He held his head high, his cold gaze sweeping the room, lingering briefly on the jury. When called to the witness stand, he smiled faintly, nodding to the judge as if stepping onto a stage. His calmness weighed heavily on the room. Reynolds approached, opening the questioning calmly. "Mr. Hart, we'll ask specific questions. Please answer clearly, yes or no." "Understood." Hart tilted his head. "I understand, but your language and mine differ. I speak of souls, you speak of crimes." Reynolds didn't respond, only nodded. He opened a file on the table. "Do you admit to being in Grace Miller's apartment on the night of May 4th, 2010? "Admit." "I don't think there's anything to admit. I was there to bring her peace." "You strangled her to death. Is that what you call peace?" Hart smiled. "I didn't kill. I stopped when she was no longer afraid." Some in the room held their breath. Reynolds locked eyes with him, voice sharper. "What about Allison Price, Laura Kent, Rachel Hayes, Dana Brooks? All died the same way. You call that purifications?" Hart tilted his head, staring distantly. "I don't call it that. God does. I just obeyed." Reynolds suppressed anger, holding up an evidence bag, a paper with "She has been set free" written on it. "This is your handwriting, correct?" Hart glanced at the paper, then answered calmly. "I wrote it for those left behind. They needed to know she was free from suffering. But you know they died from suffocation, not salvation." Hart shrugged. "That's how you see it. To me, death is just a door." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Jurors stared, some shaking their heads. Reynolds lowered his voice, staying composed. "Mr. Hart, you served in the Marines. You were trained to understand the consequences of actions. So why do you see murder as salvation?" "Because in war, I learned people only see truth when they're afraid. I gave them truth. And who are you to do that?" Hart smiled faintly, almost whispering, "I'm the one God chose when others closed their ears." A murmur spread through the room. The judge struck her gavel, calling for order. Reynolds pressed on with DNA evidence, voice firm. "We have your DNA at 5 crime scenes, fingerprints on Grace Miller's door handle, and your blood on the victim's restraints. How do you explain that?" Hart sat silent for a moment, then replied, "When you help someone cross the line, you don't hide traces. There's nothing to be ashamed of." Reynolds slammed the file down. "So you admit being there, touching them as they died?" "No, Mr. Reynolds," Hart said, voice low and clear. "I was there when they were set free." Reynolds stared at him. "Are you trying to convince this court you're innocent because you believe in God?" Hart smiled, eyes mocking. "I don't need to convince. Faith doesn't need a jury." Some in the courtroom exhaled sharply. Reynolds paused, then stepped closer. "You talk of faith, but you meticulously recorded dates, times and places of each killing. You chose victims of similar age, circumstances, living alone. You calculated every step. That's planning, not faith." Hart looked up, his gray eyes flashing defiance. "Every great plan starts with faith. You call it crime. I call it order." The statement stirred the room. Reynolds cut in, voice sharp. "Your order left 5 women dead in fear." Hart replied instantly, face unchanged. "No, they died in peace. You wouldn't understand." The judge struck her gavel 3 times to quell the noise. Reynolds took a deep breath, regaining composure, and turned to the jury. "You're hearing the defendant himself. No remorse, no shame. He believes he was right to kill." He faced Hart. "Do you regret anything, even one person?" Hart looked at him, silent for a moment, then said softly, "Regret is for those who don't understand purpose. I don't need it." A murmur spread again. Cameras panned to the jury, their faces showing shock. Hart sat upright, hands clasped, gaze unwavering. Reynolds presented the final evidence, the leather notebook from Mansfield. He opened the page reading, 6 souls have been purified. You call them souls, but you said humans can't save others. Why write this?" Hart looked at the notebook, chuckling softly, "Because they begged. I answered their prayers." Reynolds closed the book, voice low. "No, you answered their screams." For the first time, Hart paused, eyes narrowing slightly, but his smile lingered. The judge ended the questioning, ordering Hart back to his seat. As he stood, he turned to the jury, offering a faint, challenging smile. One juror clenched their hands, avoiding his gaze. Before leaving the stand, Hart spoke softly, but the microphone caught it. I'm not afraid of judgment. I've already heard it. His voice through the speakers sent chills through the room. Judge Sullivan called a recess for preliminary deliberations, demanding absolute order. The jury left in silence, faces heavy. Daniel Hart kept smiling, hands behind his back, eyes distant, as if the exchange was just part of a script he'd long memorized. On the morning of the fifth day, the courtroom atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. This was the day prosecutor Jack Reynolds would deliver his closing argument, the moment seen as deciding the case's fate. Daniel Hart sat in the defendant's seat, back straight, expression calm. He scanned the room, occasionally smiling faintly at reporters' whispers or the constant click of cameras. Reynolds stood, holding a nearly 300-page file. His voice was deep, firm, resonating in the quiet room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the past 4 days, you've heard everything. Scientific evidence, witness testimonies, and the defendant's own chilling confessions. Today, I don't need to say much more to prove Daniel Hart's guilt. I only need to repeat what he said in his own words. He paused, staring at Hart. He said, "I didn't kill anyone. I did what was assigned." He said, "They were saved." He said, "I don't need regret." Those words don't come from a madman. They come from a man who believes he has more power than anyone in this room, including justice. Reynolds stepped slowly toward the jury, voice rising. "We have his DNA on every body. We have his fingerprints on Grace Miller's door. We have the video he filmed, reciting scripture before killing. We have the notebook stating 6 souls have been purified. Every piece of evidence, every word, every note, is a knife stabbed into society's belief that justice still exists." He paused, then spoke slowly, clearly. "I want you to remember Ava Collins, the woman who survived, who saw his eyes when he said, 'You will be set free.' That wasn't the look of a madman. That was the look of someone who knew exactly what he was doing." The room was silent. Some jurors looked down, avoiding the defendant. Hart sat still, hands clasped, smile unchanged. Reynolds returned to the prosecution table, voice firm. "We're facing a man who no longer believes in humanity. He has no remorse, no fear, no sense of wrong. He only regrets not finishing his mission. A man like that, if released, will kill again, not for revenge, but to prove he's right." Reynolds held up the leather notebook. "This is evidence of intent. Every name here was planned, every death recorded like a ritual. This is organized, deliberate, and finds pleasure in power." He lowered the book, voice grave. "Such a person cannot be rehabilitated." The prosecutor moved to his final conclusion, eyes sweeping the room. "I'm not here to call for revenge. I'm here to protect the lives of others. Daniel Hart cannot be seen as a sick man. He's someone who chose evil, repeated it multiple times, and still believes he's right. The law cannot tolerate that." He looked directly at the jury. "Under Ohio law, when crimes are committed with exceptional cruelty and repetition, the highest penalty is death. I ask you to consider that sentence, not because we want to see death, but because only that verdict reflects the value of justice." Reynolds paused, his gaze softening for a moment. Grace Miller, Allison Price, Laura Kent, Rachel Hayes, Dana Brooks, those 5 women no longer have a voice. They can't recount their fear or plead for justice. But today, you are their voice, and I believe they're waiting for justice to be served. A wave of emotion swept the courtroom. Eleanor Miller covered her mouth, tears streaming. Reynolds bowed his head, closed the file, and said his final words. "Justice isn't just punishment. Justice is the affirmation that no one, not even someone claiming to be God's messenger, has the right to decide another's life." Judge Sullivan struck her gavel once, signaling the end of the prosecution's argument. Her voice was steady, stern. "Jurors, you've heard all evidence and arguments from both sides. Your task now is to deliberate and reach a preliminary verdict based on facts, not emotions." The jurors were escorted out. The door closed, leaving a silent room. Daniel Hart watched them go, his smile intact, eyes reflecting the ceiling's white light, cold and empty as the words he'd just heard. That afternoon, as Judge Mary Sullivan returned to the bench, The air remained heavy after the prosecutor's powerful closing. The jury hadn't fully left, but stayed to hear the final part. The defendant's closing statement. The judge struck her gavel lightly. Voice stern, per procedure, the court allows the defendant a final statement before deliberations. Mr. Hart, do you have anything to say? Daniel stood slowly. The faint clink of his chair echoed in the quiet room. He stepped to the center stand, carrying no papers, not glancing at his lawyer, but looking straight at the jury. His cold gray eyes scanned the room, as if gauging each person's reaction. When he spoke, his voice was clear, deep, and chillingly calm. I have no regrets. I did what needed to be done. Those people weren't killed. They were set free. You may call me a murderer. I call myself someone who fulfilled a mission. A murmur rose in the courtroom. Reporters scribbled. Victims' families held their breath. He continued, voice steady like a proclamation. I don't come from darkness, as you think. I come from a light you've forgotten. You build laws to keep your order. I follow the order of the Creator. And if the price of truth is my life, I accept it. But don't think you can judge me. Reynolds clenched his fists but stayed silent. Judge Sullivan leaned forward, asking the defendant to speak within appropriate bounds, but Hart ignored her. He turned to the victims' families. They begged for peace, and I gave it to them. I didn't take lives. I opened a door you're afraid to cross. Eleanor Miller sobbed, collapsing into her husband's shoulder. A juror looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Daniel paused, then smiled. A slow, arrogant smile. I hear they call me the liberator. They're right. I freed them from fear, from this world's lies. I did what you don't dare face human sin, and cleanse it. The judge struck her gavel, demanding order, but the commotion persisted. Some shouted monster. A security officer moved to the front row to maintain control. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Amid the chaos, Hart stood still, his smile unchanged. He continued, voice lower but sharp. You think you're protecting justice, but human justice is just legalized fear. I'm not above the law, I'm beyond it. I'm not a man, I'm a will. And whatever you sentence me to, that will lives on. Reynolds stood to object, but the judge signaled for Hart to finish. He turned to the jury, voice low and slow, almost persuasive. I see fear in your eyes. You want to believe I'm mad because if not, you'd have to accept that evil can be calm, confident, and believe it's right. But I'm not mad, I'm saner than anyone here. The word shook the room, no one breathed loudly. Hart stepped forward, eyes glinting in the light. You can't kill faith, you can kill me, but you can't erase the truth that some souls thank me for saving them. I don't need your forgiveness. Judge Sullivan struck her gavel 3 times, demanding he stop. Enough, Mr. Hart, the court has heard enough. But he added softly, almost a whisper. You'll call this a verdict. I call it the final ritual. An angry shout rose from the audience, quickly subdued by security. In that moment, Hart bowed his head slightly, as if concluding a sermon. He returned to the defendant's seat, sat, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the jury, unwavering. The judge ordered the clerk to record the defendant's statement and declared the trial's examination phase closed. Her voice was firm. The court recesses for jury deliberations. No one leaves until instructed. As the jury exited, the air remained thick with mixed emotions, anger, fear, disgust. In the front row, Eleanor Miller sobbed uncontrollably, while reporters rushed to file stories in the hallway. In the room, only Daniel Hart sat still, eyes distant, a faint smile lingering, as if he alone understood the ending he'd long anticipated. On the morning of the 6th day, the Franklin County courtroom was utterly silent as the jury returned after over 8 hours of deliberation. No one spoke. Judge Mary Sullivan sat upright, her gaze resolute. Below, Prosecutor Jack Reynolds stood by his table, hands on the thick file. Across, Daniel Hart sat calmly, hands clasped, his face, as if the morning's events didn't concern him. As the clerk announced, "All rise," the courtroom stood. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with silver hair, stepped to the stand, holding a white sheet. He looked at the judge, voice steady. "After reviewing all evidence and testimony, we, the Ohio jury, unanimously find the defendant Daniel Hart guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and related charges." The room held its breath. The judge nodded, asking him to read the sentencing recommendation. The jury unanimously recommends the maximum penalty under Ohio law, death by lethal injection. A murmur rose and quickly faded. Judge Sullivan adjusted her glasses, looking at the defendant. Her voice was clear, cold. "Daniel Hart, this court finds you guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of rape with violence. Given the exceptional severity and lack of mitigating factors, the court sentences you to death by lethal injection, to be carried out at the Ohio State Penitentiary per legal procedure." The air seemed to freeze. Hart's expression didn't change. He looked up at the judge, his face eerily calm. As Sullivan paused, he nodded slightly, as if hearing a preordained announcement. No anger, no pleas, no trace of a man facing death, just an empty, chilling acceptance. In the front row, Eleanor Miller covered her mouth, sobbing silently. Richard held his wife, tears streaming down his face. Behind them, Ava Collins bowed her head, hands clenched tightly. Prosecutor Reynolds nodded slightly, his face stern but not triumphant. He whispered to a colleague, "Justice has been served, though no one wins in this." Outside the courthouse, as the news spread, the crowd erupted in mixed reactions. Many shouted, "Justice for Grace," while others prayed in silence. Media broadcast live footage of the jury leaving, with bold headlines flashing, "The Liberator sentenced to death." Reporters swarmed the prosecutor for his reaction. Reynolds replied briefly, "No one rejoices when someone is sentenced to death. But society needs to know that the law is stronger than the warped beliefs of a man who thinks he's God." His words were immediately quoted on air. Meanwhile, Daniel Hart was escorted out by 2 officers. He turned for a final look at the courtroom. His gaze wasn't angry, just cold and distant. A reporter described, "As he left, he looked like someone who'd completed a ritual, not a man sentenced to death." Passing through the police barricade, a reporter shouted, "Hart, do you have anything to say to the victims' families?" He paused for half a second, turned and said softly, "They're at peace." The statement sparked outrage. Someone in the crowd threw a water bottle at him, but security quickly intervened. That afternoon, the verdict was officially recorded in Ohio's judicial records under Case 10-2147, State of Ohio versus Daniel Hart. The 32-page sentencing document detailed all charges, evidence, and the court's decision. Below, Judge Mary Sullivan's signature was stamped with Ohio's red seal. Copies of the verdict were sent to the governor's office for execution confirmation. That evening, news of the sentence dominated national headlines. CNN aired a special, "The Final Judgment, Death for the Liberator." Commentators analyzed Hart's demeanor, his chilling calmness, lack of remorse, and defiance. A psychologist noted, "That's the scariest part, when evil doesn't scream but smiles." At Chillicothe prison, Hart was transferred to death row isolation. Guards reported he remained silent during the transfer, not speaking a word. When asked if he wanted to call anyone, he replied, "No one needs to hear more." In Columbus, residents gathered around the courthouse until late. Some lit candles for the victims, others held signs thanking justice. Though reactions varied, all felt a dark chapter of the city had closed. In the empty courtroom, the wooden chairs still held the warmth of those who sat there. On the judge's bench, the final verdict lay, its bold text reading, "Death penalty imposed per Ohio law." The story of Daniel Hart, the man who claimed the right to purify others' souls, is not just a criminal tragedy, but a mirror reflecting a societal illness present in modern America. The radicalization of personal beliefs and the erosion of empathy. Hart wasn't a monster born from nothing. He was a product of a society where loneliness, warped faith, and psychological isolation can grow unnoticed. From an isolated former Marine, he found in distorted religion a reason to exist, and that blind faith led him to believe murder was salvation. In today's America, we see other versions of Hart in religious extremism, gun violence, or online hate movements, all starting from the belief that I'm right and others deserve punishment. The lesson from this case isn't in the death penalty, but in society's responsibility to identify and intervene early in signs of psychological deviance. Programs for veterans, mental health care, and education on diverse beliefs need serious investment to give Daniel Hart's help before they become threats. The story also reminds us of empathy's power. If someone had listened to Hart, noticed his isolation and obsession, perhaps those 5 women wouldn't have died. In a free society like America, justice isn't just in courtrooms, it begins with how we care, understand, and take responsibility for each other before tragedy strikes. If this story makes you reflect on the line between faith and crime, hit subscribe to explore more real cases that shook America. Thank you for following to the end. See you in the next video, where justice, fear, and truth collide once more.